The lunch rush hit Sunset Griddle like a storm, plates clattering, tickets piling, voices rising with the smell of sizzling bacon and burnt toast. Claire Dawson wiped her brow with the back of her wrist, her ponytail damp from sweat and steam. She had just cleared 3 tables, refilled 5 coffee cups, and was halfway through taking a to-go order when she noticed him. He stood near the entrance like a shadow lost in daylight, frail, drenched. A tattered army green jacket hung loose on his narrow frame, and the worn boots on his feet looked like they'd walked through 100 winters. His white hair clung to his forehead, and his eyes, dull but searching, scanned the room for something that wasn't there. Most customers didn't see him. A few did and looked away. Claire's heart tugged before her brain even caught up. She stepped out from behind the counter, past the blinking order screen, and gently approached him. "Sir," she said softly, "are you okay?" The man blinked, unsure. I think I was supposed to meet someone here." His voice was rough, tired in a way that ran deeper than sleep. Around his neck, hidden just beneath the jacket, Claire glimpsed a tarnished dog tag, a war relic. Her throat tightened. "Let's get you warm first," she said, offering her arm. "You can wait as long as you need." She led him to an empty booth in the back, grabbed a throw blanket from the lost and found bin, and draped it over his shoulders. He gave a small smile, more a twitch of memory than joy. Claire ducked into the kitchen, slipped a $10 bill from her tips into the register, and looked at the cook. "Ronnie, can I get a plate of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, extra gravy? Add cornbread." Ronnie nodded without asking. He'd worked with Claire long enough to know when she broke the rules, it was for a reason. She placed the plate gently in front of the old man, who looked at it as if it might disappear. "You didn't have to," he whispered. Claire smiled. "Yes, I did," but as she turned back to the floor, a voice sliced through the buzz of the diner. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" It was Martin Keller, her manager. Slicked back hair, permanent scowl, and he wasn't just angry, he was livid. Before she could answer, he raised his voice so everyone could hear. "You're fired, Claire. Right now, get your things. You're done." The diner went quiet. Forks hovered midair. The old man looked up, confusion clouding his eyes. Claire stood frozen, not in fear, but in disbelief. And in that moment, everything changed. Claire didn't say a word. Not when Martin's voice boomed through the diner. Not when customers stared at her like she was the villain in a play they hadn't paid to see. She untied her apron, folded it slowly, and placed it on the counter like it was something sacred. Her cheeks burned not from shame, but from fury held tightly behind her teeth. As she walked toward the door, Mr. Walter Brooks tried to rise, but his knees buckled. "I'm so sorry," he rasped, barely loud enough for her to hear. "It's okay," Claire said, steadying him. "You didn't do anything wrong." The door swung shut behind her, and the sound of rain met her like a cold slap. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, it as though the world had tilted and no one else had noticed. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped outside, the cold rain masking the warmth of tears she refused to let fall. She didn't know what her next move was, just that it couldn't be turning back. Inside the diner, the silence was thick. Martin adjusted his tie with smug satisfaction and barked at the cook to keep orders moving. Most customers turned back to their meals. Most, but not all. The bell above the door jingled again, but this time it didn't chime, it thundered. 4 men entered, not young, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Marines, every one of them. Boots polished metals, gleaming eyes sharp. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The energy shifted. A presence settled into the diner like a verdict. They moved with purpose, every step echoing with silent authority. A young boy at the counter gasped and whispered to his mother, "Are they real soldiers?" She hushed him, eyes wide, unsure what to make of the scene. They walked in formations, stopping at Walter Brooks' booth. He looked up, and for the first time in years, his eyes lit with something fierce. Recognition, gratitude, and a trace of pride. "Sir," one said, saluting. "We got your message." Martin looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Yes," said the tallest Marine. "You can explain why a woman was fired for showing compassion to one of our own." Martin's expression soured. "She broke policy." "That's not your concern," wrong, another Marine said firmly. "That man in the booth served with our unit's founder." When he speaks, we listen. A murmur stirred among the customers. Megan, the teenage waitress by the soda fountain, dropped her rag. Claire's the only reason I didn't quit my first week, she said aloud. She walked me to my car every night. I saw what happened, said a man near the jukebox. She paid for his meal with her own money. The Marine's tone was steady, but it carried the weight of 1,000 drills of buried friends of medals earned in silence. The kind of weight that made truth unavoidable. Martin's grip on authority slipped like butter on a hot skillet. One by one, voices joined. An elderly couple. A mother with her child. Even Ronnie the cook leaned out of the kitchen window. She's been the heart of this place for years, Ronnie said. And you fired her over kindness. A teenager near the window stood up. She helped me fill out college applications. She stayed late just to listen when my dad got deployed, he said. His voice cracked, but no one laughed. They listened. Martin's face turned red. This is ridiculous. No, said the Marine with the silver oak leaf on his lapel. What's ridiculous is mistaking power for leadership. What that young woman did, that was honor. Customers stood. Some clapped. Some walked out. One of the Marines turned to Walter Brooks. Sir, would you like us to escort you? The old man nodded slowly, gripping the table for balance. But first, he said, voice firming with resolve, someone needs to thank that girl. The rain soaked through Claire's hoodie, and her fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from a mixture of disbelief and raw hurt. She replayed the moment over and over in her head, the warmth in Mr. Brooks' eyes, the sting of Martin's words, the deafening silence of the room. Part of her wanted to scream, another part wanted to run, but instead she just stood there gripping the apron like it was a lifeline to something bigger than the job she had just lost. Claire turned slowly. Her eyes wet from the rain met the Marine's, and suddenly she didn't feel small anymore. She didn't feel fired. She felt seen, respected, and for the first time that day, not alone. And then the door opened behind her, and everything started to change. Customers stared in stunned silence. The sight of uniformed Marines standing shoulder to shoulder with Claire Dawson had cracked something wide open inside the Sunset Griddle. A line had been crossed, and now people were choosing sides. An older woman in the corner booth stood first. She was barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and a cane clutched in her left hand. She placed 2 $10 bills on the edge of her table and turned to the room. That girl served my son here every morning before he left for Afghanistan, she said, her voice trembling but fierce. And Martin, you've never even learned my name. I won't be eating here again. Her cane clicked against the tile as she left, silence following in her wake like a shadow. Next came the trucker at the bar, Tommy Ray, known for his gruff voice and plate-sized hands. He rose slowly, finished the last sip of his coffee, and pulled out a 20. This is for the man she fed, he said, nodding toward Mr. Brooks. And for the waitress who remembered how I like my eggs better than my own wife does. The register dinged as he dropped the bill and walked out without another word. Martin Keller stood behind the counter, arms crossed tightly over his chest, jaw clenched. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in the rising tension. He'd lost control of the room, and worse, he knew it. More customers followed. Some muttered words of support to Claire as they passed. Others simply left folded bills beside their coffee mugs. In a matter of minutes, half the diner had emptied, and a small pile of cash had accumulated near booth 5, where Mr. Brooks sat watching with moist eyes and shaking hand. But it wasn't just the customers. Jasmine, the high school trainee, who usually blended into the background, quietly stepped out from behind the soda machine. She looked scared but determined. I'm sorry, Mr. Keller, she said softly, but I can't work here if kindness gets punished. She untied her apron and set it on the counter beside the register, her eyes glancing toward Claire. Thank you, she whispered, then turned and walked out the front door, head held high. Raphael, the longtime cook, peeked out from the kitchen. His voice, usually reserved for greasy orders and griddle jokes, echoed louder than usual. I've worked back here for 14 years, he said, wiping his hands on his apron. Never saw a manager humiliate someone like that for doing the right thing. Martin opened his mouth to protest, but Raphael didn't wait. He hung his apron on a hook by the kitchen door and looked at Claire. I don't know what comes next, but if you ever need a reference, I'm your guy. Claire stood motionless, still clutching the apron Martin had thrown at her just moments ago. She had expected tears, rage, even total silence, but not this. The weight of so many people standing with her made her heart pound in disbelief. The Marines remained stoic, their presence a quiet reassurance behind her. One of them, Sergeant Dean Michaels, stepped forward once more. His voice was calm, unwavering. "This community has spoken," he said, turning toward Martin. "Not with fists, not with shouting, but with their feet and their dollars." Martin's eyes darted around, searching for support, but even his regulars had vanished. His staff was down to one barista hiding behind the milkshake machine. He muttered something under his breath about overreacting and social media mobs, but it was no use. Claire slowly turned toward Mr. Brooks, who hadn't said much since his meal began. He stood now, gently pressing his hand against the table for balance. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," he said, his voice scratchy with emotion. "I just wanted something warm and someone kind." She stepped forward and touched his shoulder. "You didn't cause anything, sir. You reminded people what matters." He nodded and with surprising steadiness removed a small tarnished pin from the inside of his coat. A purple heart dulled with age but gleaming in the sunlight that streamed through the front windows. "This belongs with you now," he said softly, pressing it into Claire's hand. "You served today, more than most ever will." Tears welled up in her eyes as she held it, unable to speak. Outside, people had started to gather. Word had spread fast. Some held their phones up, others just stood in quiet solidarity. A local reporter began taking notes from the sidewalk. A police cruiser rolled by and didn't stop. Inside, Claire stood, surrounded by empty booths, dollar bills, and unwavering Marines. She didn't have her job anymore, but somehow she had more than she'd started the day with. And Martin Keller, arms still crossed, now stood alone behind his counter. The man who thought compassion was a liability had just watched it turn into the most powerful force in the room. The video was only 72 seconds long, but by sunset it had been shared over 4 million times. Captured on a customer's phone and posted with the caption, "She was fired for feeding a veteran." It swept through social media like wildfire. The image of Claire Dawson standing with tears in her eyes, aprons still in hand, facing off against Martin, Keller's cold dismissal, and the arrival of 4 Marines backing her up became the symbol of something bigger than just a bad day at a diner. Within hours, "Stand with Claire" began trending nationwide. Veterans reposted it with messages of support. One tweet from a retired colonel read, "She did more for that Marine than most have done for me in years. I'd hire her tomorrow." News outlets picked it up by morning. Local anchors were outside the Sunset Griddle diner by 8 a.m., pointing at the booth where Mr. Walter Brooks had quietly eaten his mashed potatoes the day before. Inside the diner, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. It was no longer the buzzing lunchtime spot it had once been. Customers walked in, glanced around, then turned and left. Some paused only to take photos of the "Now Hiring" sign taped over the window Claire had cleaned every morning before her shift. Martin Keller, who had once strutted through the restaurant like a king among his peasants, now avoided eye contact with anyone. The video didn't just expose his harshness, it showcased his inability to read the room, to recognize basic human decency. People weren't just angry about Claire, they were angry about the culture he had allowed to fester. The smugness, the punishment of kindness, the weaponization of authority, it all came to the surface in those 72 seconds. Meanwhile, Claire stayed quiet. She hadn't spoken to any reporters, hadn't made any dramatic posts, hadn't even opened her inbox. She was overwhelmed, unsure what to make of the hundreds of messages pouring in, job offers, thank you notes, and shared stories from strangers saying they too had once been punished for choosing kindness. But one message stood out. It came from the Haggerty Veterans Resource Center, a nonprofit just outside of town. It read simply, "Dear Miss Dawson, we saw what happened. Mr. Brooks is like family to us. If you're looking for a place where compassion is considered a strength, not a liability, we'd be honored to have you." Attached was a formal offer letter, full-time, higher pay benefits, and a role helping veterans and their families navigate housing, healthcare, and reintegration support. Claire sat on her small couch reading it 3 times. It felt surreal. She had no grand ambitions when she handed Mr. Brooks that meal, only a gut instinct that a man like that should never be made to feel invisible. And now the world was watching. 2 days later, she visited the Haggerty Center. It was nothing like the diner. The walls were lined with old photographs, platoons, medals, folded flags. A sense of quiet purpose filled every hallway. When she stepped through the front door, the receptionist stood and smiled wide. "You must be Claire," she said. "Mr. Brooks is waiting for you in the back." Claire blinked. "He's here. He hasn't stopped talking about you." She followed the hallway to a small, sunlit room where Walter Brooks sat with a crossword puzzle in his lap and a fresh cup of tea beside him. When he saw her, he stood slowly extending both hands. "You fed me," he said, his voice still gravelly but firm. "You didn't look away." Claire felt her eyes sting. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," he said gently. "That's where you are wrong. Most people don't. That's why it mattered." They sat together for a while, saying little. Outside the center, a news van rolled by, but Claire didn't look. Her world had already shifted, not because she had gone viral, but because she now belonged somewhere that saw her value from the beginning. Back at the Sunset Griddle, Martin tried damage control. He issued a written apology claiming a lapse in judgment, but the public wasn't buying it. A petition demanding his resignation reached over 25,000 signatures. Former employees came forward with their own stories. Even Jasmine, the young trainee who had walked out with Claire, gave an emotional interview about how that one act of compassion taught her more about leadership than any job had before. The diner's Yelp rating plummeted. Review titles read like headlines. "Compassion isn't a crime avoid unless you hate veterans," and Claire Dawson for mayor. Martin Keller's silence became deafening. And as the days passed, the community made one thing undeniably clear. Kindness was not just remembered, it was defended. And Claire, she didn't return to the diner. She had already found something far better. Months passed, but the ripple never faded. Claire Dawson settled into her new role at the Brooks Veterans Outreach Center with quiet resolve. No longer rushing coffee orders or memorizing breakfast specials. She now greeted veterans by name, helped them fill out paperwork for housing, listened to stories that had gone untold for decades, and made sure that no one felt unseen. Her days were steady, meaningful. She still rode the same bus route every morning, but now she stepped off with purpose. Her desk, simple and sunlit, was covered in thank you notes, calendars, and a photo of her standing beside Walter Brooks, both of them smiling, surrounded by the center's staff on her first day. On a rainy afternoon in November, she found Walter in the common room, seated with a blanket across his lap and a steaming cup of tea by his elbow. He looked up and smiled as she entered. "You still here, young lady?" he teased, eyes twinkling. Claire laughed, sitting beside him. "You're the reason I stayed." He leaned back, his voice quieter now. "That day at the diner, I thought I was invisible. I didn't expect anyone to notice, let alone stand up. But you did. You changed everything." She looked down, her fingers twisting her bracelet. "It was just a plate of food." Walter shook his head gently. "No, it was dignity served warm. And it reminded me that decency still lives in this world." They sat in silence for a long moment, rain pattering softly against the windows. Outside, a few volunteers unloaded donated supplies. Inside, Claire realized something she hadn't fully processed until now. Her life had shifted not from ambition, but from a choice to be kind without expecting anything in return. A small act done quietly had spoken louder than all the shouting in the world. Across town, the diner was under new ownership. The walls had been repainted, the name changed, and Martin Keller had long disappeared from public view. But Claire's story remained a whispered legacy shared among servers, teachers, veterans, and teens. It became a reminder that doing the right thing doesn't always feel loud or heroic in the moment. Sometimes it just looks like handing someone a warm meal, even if no one is watching. In a world that often rewards loudness and speed, kindness, done in silence, still has the power to echo. Claire didn't ask for applause, she offered humanity. And in doing so, she reminded us all that compassion isn't weakness. It's the foundation of community.